On a Thursday morning in late October, the kind of morning where the frost hasn't quite decided whether to stay or go, Marcus Holt stood at the edge of a drainage ditch on the eastern boundary of the Calverton County Highway Depot and watched $340,000 worth of machinery fail to move a single truck. Not a semi, not a loaded freighter, a dump truck. One standard issue, county-owned, 12-wheel dump truck that had slid off the access road 2 days prior dropped its rear axle into the soft shoulder and then sunk, slowly, stubbornly, and with what felt like deliberate malice, until the entire rear chassis was swallowed by the earth up to its frame rails. The ground out there was black clay mixed with gravel fill, or the kind of soil that engineering textbooks describe as cohesive, and that every working man on a job site calls a trap. It grabs, it holds, and once it holds, it does not let go without a fight. The truck had been hauling fill for a new overpass approach when the driver had misjudged the edge of the road by about 2 feet. That was all it took. 2 feet to the wrong side and the shoulder gave way like a trapdoor. The cab stayed on the road, tilted at a nauseating angle, while the rear end dropped and kept dropping until the chassis itself was resting on the earth. The driver had walked away fine. The truck had not. Now, 48 hours later, the truck was still there. And Marcus Holt, who was the project manager for the overpass contract and a man who had spent 22 years building things and never once failed to finish on schedule, was starting to understand what failure felt like up close. Let me tell you about Marcus Holt, because you need to understand who he was before you can understand what happened to him. Marcus had started out swinging a hammer for a general contractor in Dayton, Ohio, fresh out of a 2-year technical program, and by 30 he had his own small crew. By 35 he had a company. By 42 he had a company worth talking about, Holt Civil Incorporated, 40 full-time employees, $2 million in equipment, and a reputation for finishing highway contracts on time and under budget. Marty drove a black Ford Super Duty with the company logo on the door and a diamond plate toolbox in the bed that had never actually held tools, because Marcus Holt did not do tools anymore. He wore Carhartt jackets that were new enough to still have the creases in them. He had a project management software subscription that cost more per month than most of his subcontractors made in a week. Marcus was not a bad man. That needs to be said plainly. He was not cruel, and he was not dishonest, but he had accumulated enough success that he had stopped questioning his own instincts, and that is a particular kind of dangerous that tends to reveal itself at the worst possible moments. He believed in horsepower, he believed in reach and torque ratings and the impressive specifications printed on the sides of machines. If a problem could not be solved by applying more engineered force, Marcus generally assumed the problem was with the engineers not applying enough of it. He had called the company's largest wrecker first, a 60-ton rotator unit, a machine that costs upward of $800,000 new and can, under the right circumstances, right a fully loaded tractor-trailer on a mountain highway. It had arrived Tuesday afternoon, set its outriggers in the gravel, and pulled until the cables sang. The truck had not moved an inch. What had moved was the rotator itself. The outriggers had begun to creep inward in the soft ground, and the operator had wisely called it off before the whole operation became 2 stuck vehicles instead of 1. Let me tell you about that Tuesday afternoon, because it set the tone for everything that followed. But the rotator operator, a man named Davis with 30 years on heavy recovery, had climbed down from his cab and stood next to Marcus and said, quietly and without drama, "The ground won't hold me. Every pound I pull on that truck, I'm pulling myself toward it. I can't get purchase." Marcus had nodded as if he understood, and then made 3 phone calls in quick succession to find something bigger. What arrived Wednesday morning were 2 additional recovery vehicles, a 40-ton conventional wrecker and an excavator on a lowboy that Marcus had rented from a yard in Columbus at a rate he had agreed to without asking the price. The plan was straightforward. The excavator would dig away the earth from around the truck's buried rear axle while the 2 wreckers pulled from opposite angles, distributing the load. It was a reasonable plan. Look, it was the plan that any competent engineer would have drawn up on a whiteboard and presented with quiet confidence. It failed in a way that managed to be both spectacular and deeply demoralizing. The excavator, working in the soft ground beside the ditch, had moved roughly 4 feet before its tracks began to sink. The operator attempted to compensate by laying down steel mats, but the mats simply pressed down into the clay alongside the tracks. By midday Wednesday, the excavator had managed to expose perhaps 18 inches of the truck's rear axle before it was effectively immobilized in the mud, its engines screaming at a task it could accomplish no further. One of the wreckers had snapped a rigging chain, a 3/4-inch alloy chain rated for 22 tons, when the truck shifted 3 degrees to the left and then stopped. The chain had parted with a sound like a rifle shot and coiled itself around a fence post 30 feet away. By Wednesday evening, Marcus had an excavator that couldn't move, 1 wrecker with a broken rigging setup, and a county project deadline that was now 72 hours away. He also had an engineer from the county's office standing beside him telling him that if the truck wasn't recovered and the access road cleared by Monday morning, the overpass contract was in jeopardy. That was Thursday. That was the morning Marcus was standing at the edge of the ditch, watching the ground refuse to give up what it had taken. He heard the truck before he saw it. It was a sound that did not belong to the decade or even the century. A low, rhythmic knock, steady and deliberate, till accompanied by the occasional sound of metal settling against metal in a way that suggested age rather than damage. It came from down the county road, from the direction of the old grain elevator that had stopped operating sometime in the early part of the previous decade. Marcus turned. His foreman, a man named Greeley, turned. 3 of the recovery crew turned. What came down the road was a flatbed truck of uncertain vintage. It may have been a late 50s International, though the cab had been modified enough times that certainty was impossible, pulling an equipment trailer. On the trailer was something Marcus could not immediately identify. It was large. It was green in the way that old machinery is green, which is to say the green had faded and oxidized into a color that is not quite any specific color anymore, just the memory of green. There were steel wheels. There was a front grille that looked like it belonged on something that had been manufactured when grills were still considered a design statement. And there was a man in the cab who, when the truck stopped and he opened the door, turned out to be in his late 70s or early 80s, wearing clean denim overalls over a flannel shirt and moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has not been in a hurry in a very long time. Let me tell you about Earl Maybury, because this story does not exist without him. Earl Maybury had farmed the same 312 acres in Calverton County for 51 years. He had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father, and the Mabry family name was on a road sign 2 miles north of where Marcus was standing, which was the county's modest way of acknowledging that some families have been somewhere long enough to be considered part of the landscape. Earl was not the kind of man who attended county meetings and complained about the way things were going. He was the kind of man who watched and listened and remembered things. He had watched the Highway Depot get built in 1987. He had watched 3 different project managers cycle through the overpass contract in the past 4 years, and for 2 days he had watched from across his east field a collection of very large and very expensive machines fail to move a truck that was stuck in the ground. Earl did not make phone calls. He did not submit suggestions. He had loaded his equipment the previous evening. Mai told his wife he'd be back by noon and driven down the county road at the speed his truck was comfortable with, which was not fast. He walked to the edge of the ditch, put his hands in the pockets of his overalls, and looked at the truck for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Marcus and said, "Saw your problem. Thought I might be able to help." Marcus looked at Earl. He looked at the flatbed trailer. He looked at the thing on the trailer. He had been awake since 4 in the morning, and he had not eaten anything since the previous night, and he was in the particular emotional territory that exists just beyond exhaustion, where things seem either very serious or very funny, and there is not much in between. What he felt in that moment was, shamefully, amusement. "That's an Oliver," Greeley said quietly from behind Marcus. And he said it in a tone that suggested he recognized it and had a memory attached to it. "What?" Marcus said. "Farm tractor. Old one?" Marcus looked at the machine on the trailer again. He could see it now. The long hood, the wide rear axles, the bulk of a thing, designed to pull stumps and break ground and do the kind of agricultural work that does not pause for weather or schedules. It was enormous in the way that old machines are enormous, which is a different kind of enormous than modern machines. Modern machines are enormous in their reach, in their height, in the complexity of their hydraulics. Old machines are enormous in their solidity, in the sheer mass of iron packed into every component, in the sense that they were designed to be indestructible rather than efficient. Marcus Holt laughed. It was not a mean laugh, or rather, it was not intended to be mean, but it was the laugh of a man who has spent 2 days watching $300,000 of modern machinery fail and has now been offered a solution by an elderly farmer with a tractor that appeared to have been manufactured before the invention of the television. He laughed, and some of his crew laughed with him, and the laugh carried across the ditch and out over Earl Mabry's east field. Earl Mabry did not laugh. He waited until the laughter was finished. "Your equipment's been pulling," Earl said. It was a statement, not a question. "We've had 2 wreckers and a 60-ton rotator out here," Marcus said. "We've pulled from 3 angles. The ground won't hold the anchor points." Earl nodded slowly. "Pulling machines need ground to push against," he said. "You've been fighting the soil. That Oliver doesn't pull the same way." "With respect," Marcus said, and he did not sound particularly respectful. "That thing is an antique. My rotator puts out 60 tons of pulling force. What does that tractor put out?" "About 40 horses," Earl said, pleasantly. The laughter came again, harder this time. 40 horsepower, Marcus said, against a 30-ton truck buried in clay. "Horsepower tells you how fast something works," Earl said. "Doesn't tell you how hard. That machine has a drawbar pull rating of over 8,000 pounds sustained. More importantly, it weighs 11,000 pounds on steel wheels, and it doesn't need soft ground to anchor itself because it doesn't pull from a fixed point. It pulls from motion. The wheels walk it forward. Every inch the wheels turn, it puts that force into the load. It doesn't jerk. It doesn't snap. It leans." Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone explain something with such quiet certainty that the explanation itself felt more convincing than any demonstration could have been? Have you ever been in the presence of knowledge that wasn't performing itself, that wasn't trying to impress you, and found yourself paying attention in spite of yourself? Earl Mabry was not lecturing Marcus Holt. He was just telling him how things worked. And underneath all of Marcus's exhaustion and frustration, and the remnants of that laughter, something in him had gone very still and was listening. He was still skeptical. He would tell you that himself, years later. But he had stopped laughing. It fails, Marcus said, and you've wasted both our time. Fails, Earl said, and I've wasted a morning. You've lost nothing but a few hours you don't have anything else to do with anyway. Marcus looked at Greeley. Greeley's expression said nothing readable. Marcus looked at the truck in the ditch. He looked back at Earl. If it works, Marcus said, what do you want? There's a preservation society over in Mansfield that keeps old farm equipment running for schools and county fairs, Earl said. Donation of your choosing. Whatever you think a morning's work is worth. Marcus almost laughed again. He caught it. Fine, he said. Go ahead. Earl walked back to his trailer without any indication of hurry. Let me tell you about that, Oliver, because it deserves a proper introduction. The machine on Earl Mabry's flatbed was a 1933 Oliver Hart-Parr 2844, and it had been manufactured in Charles City, Iowa, at a time when farm equipment was designed around a simple and uncompromising philosophy. It must not fail, because if it fails, the family doesn't eat. The Hart-Parr Company, which had merged with Oliver in 1929, built tractors with the assumption that they would be operated by a single farmer, far from any dealer, in conditions that no engineer in a factory had ever personally experienced. They built them heavy, they built them redundant, they built them with the understanding that a machine's real test was not in a demonstration field, but in a decade of January mornings and August afternoons and every piece of weather between. The 28 to 44 designation referred to the drawbar horsepower and the belt horsepower, 28 at the drawbar, 44 at the belt pulley. Those were tested figures, guaranteed figures, to figures the company stood behind in an era when advertising claims were sometimes the only legal document a farmer had. The machine weighed just under 11,000 pounds. It ran on a four-cylinder engine with a bore and stroke that would seem ludicrous by modern standards, a slow-turning, low-compression engine designed to run on low-grade kerosene fuel for an entire working day without overheating or requiring attention. Earl's grandfather had purchased it new in 1933, which was not a year when a family purchased a large piece of equipment without serious deliberation. The purchase had cost $420, which in the context of 1933 rural Ohio was the kind of money that represented a full season's profit, and then some. Earl's grandfather had driven it off the dealer's lot in early April and had ploughed his entire eastern acreage with it before the end of May, and by the time the first winter came, the family had quietly concluded that it was the best decision they had made in a generation. The tractor had worked continuously through the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. It had pulled stumps, dragged drainage tile, pulled wagons loaded beyond any reasonable specification, and in 1944 had been used to pull a neighbour's case tractor out of a flooded creek bed, a story that had been told in the Mabry family for 2 generations. It had been put into storage in 1961 when Earl's father had purchased a more modern machine, not because the Oliver had failed, but because the new tractor was faster and the fields had grown and time had become the limiting factor rather than power. Earl had found it in his grandfather's back barn in 1987 under a canvas tarp and 30 years of dust. He had spent 18 months restoring it, not as a showpiece, not for competitions or county fairs, though he had taken it to a few, but because he could not bring himself to let something that had worked that hard for that long simply rust away. He had machined several replacement parts himself on a lathe in his workshop. He had rebuilt the carburetor twice. He had fabricated new steel wheel lugs from bar stock when the originals had cracked, casting them to the original dimensions from a technical manual he had located at a library in Columbus. The tractor ran, but not as a memory of running, not as a demonstration. It ran the way it had always run. Slowly, deliberately, and with the deep mechanical confidence of something that has no reason to hurry because it has never failed to arrive. Earl offloaded it from the trailer with a pair of wooden ramps that he had clearly used many times before. He drove it off the flatbed in low range, and the steel wheels bit into the gravel shoulder with a sound like measured footsteps. He parked it beside the ditch and climbed down and walked around the stuck truck for a long time, looking at angles. His crew, which consisted of one man, a younger neighbor named Fletcher, who appeared to be in his 40s and had ridden in the passenger seat of the International in silence, began unpacking rigging from a wooden box on the trailer. Nor was not the nylon strapping and snap hooks of modern recovery equipment. Chain. Old, heavy, dark chain with a patina on each link that suggested it had been doing this work for a long time. Marcus watched. His crew watched. Earl measured the angle from the Oliver's drawbar to the truck's rear frame. He had Fletcher adjust the position of the tractor twice before he was satisfied. He ran the chain at a shallow angle, avoiding the direct pull that had defeated the wreckers, instead aiming for what Marcus would later understand was the natural direction of the truck's path out of the hole. Not straight back, but slightly forward and to the left, following the geometry of the original slide. He set a snatch block, a heavy pulley, again clearly old, against the concrete apron of the depot entrance, which was solid ground. And the chain ran from the Oliver's drawbar to the snatch block, and from the snatch block at a changed angle to the truck's rear frame. It was a simple mechanical advantage setup, elementary physics, the kind of thing you would find in a 19th century engineering primer. The snatch block doubled the effective pull while halving the load on the tractor's anchor, and the change of direction meant the force was being applied in a more favorable geometry than anything the wreckers had attempted. Marcus looked at his foreman, and his foreman looked at him, and neither of them said anything because both of them understood in that moment that this was something they should have thought of themselves. Earl climbed back onto the Oliver. He did not start it dramatically. He engaged the choke, primed the fuel line with a small hand pump on the side of the engine, advanced the throttle to its lowest working position, and turned the starter. The engine caught on the second try with a sound that was unlike any engine sound Marcus Holt had heard in his professional life. It was deep and slow, and each power stroke was individually audible, a rhythm of 4 cylinders firing in sequence at an idle that would have seemed impossibly low on any modern machine. The whole tractor settled into a vibration that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. Earl let it warm for 7 minutes, not 6, not 8, 7, which was what the machine required on a morning of this temperature. Then he engaged the clutch, and the Oliver took up the slack in the chain. He and the chain came tight with a sound like a single low note struck on a very large instrument, and Earl Mabry leaned forward slightly on the seat, and the tractor walked forward. "Let me tell you about the next 4 minutes." The Oliver did not lurch. It did not spin its wheels. The steel lugs bit into the gravel with each rotation, each lug finding ground and pushing against it, and the machine moved forward at a pace that a man could have matched at a casual walk. The chain stayed tight. The engine note dropped 3 or 4 tones lower as the load came on, from a slow, idle knock to something deeper, something that seemed to come from inside the earth itself rather than from the tractor. For 90 seconds nothing happened, except that the engine worked, and the chain stayed tight, and Marcus Holt stopped breathing. Then the truck moved. It did not explode upward out of the clay. It did not surge or lurch or come free all at once. It moved the way things move when the force being applied is patient and sustained and precise. It crept. Half an inch. An inch. The rear end rotated slightly to the left, following the geometry Earl had set up, following the natural arc of least resistance through the clay. The engine note on the Oliver dropped another tone and steadied there and held. Greeley said something under his breath that Marcus could not hear. 2 inches. 3. The rear axle was beginning to emerge from the clay, and Marcus could see the earth releasing its grip with visible reluctance, the surface cracking in radiating lines from the truck's frame like something alive, letting go of something it had intended to keep. For 4 minutes after Earl Mabry had engaged the clutch, the truck's rear wheels were on solid ground. Earl walked the Oliver forward 3 more full-wheel rotations to make certain the truck was clear of the slope, then stopped, disengaged the drive, and let the engine return to its idle. He climbed down. His crew, Fletcher, was already uncoupling the chain. Marcus Holt's crew had not moved. They were standing in a line at the edge of the ditch, and several of them were not closing their mouths. Earl walked to the snatch block, freed it from the concrete apron, coiled its chain in his arm, and handed it to Fletcher. He pulled a rag from the pocket of his overalls and wiped his hands, which were not dirty, because he had not done anything requiring dirty hands. He was doing it out of habit. Marcus walked toward him and stopped 6 feet away. He did not know what to say. He had been building things for 22 years. He had moved earth and poured concrete and driven steel piles into bedrock. He had managed projects of significant complexity and managed them well, and he had just watched a man in his 80s use a 90-year-old tractor to accomplish in 4 minutes what $340,000 of modern machinery had failed to accomplish in 2 days. Earl looked at the truck, then at Marcus, and his expression was the expression of a man who is not interested in the satisfaction of being right. "The modern machines pull from where they're standing," Earl said. "They need anchor. The Oliver moves to where the work is. Different kind of pull." That was all he said, or he walked back to his flatbed and began loading the Oliver. Marcus stood there for a long moment. Then he went to his truck and sat in the cab for a while. The following morning, a Friday, Marcus drove to Earl Mabry's farm. He had looked up the address in the county property records, and he had driven down the county road past the grain elevator and past the road sign with the Mabry name on it, and he had pulled into a gravel drive and parked beside a barn that was old enough to have been built with hand-cut lumber and still stood without apology. Earl was in the barn. He was at a workbench doing something with a piece of equipment Marcus did not recognize, something that involved small components laid out in a precise order on a clean cloth. He looked up when Marcus came in and waited. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said, "and I owe you a check." Earl set down what he was working on. "The apology first," he said. "It was not unkind, it was just the order of things." Marcus told him about the laugh. Specifically about that first laugh, the one that had carried across the field. He told him he had been wrong to laugh and that he had known he was wrong to laugh, even as he was doing it, which was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in a long time. Earl listened without interrupting. "Those machines you brought out," Earl said when Marcus was finished. "They're built to tell you what they can do, the spec sheets, the ratings, the size of them. They're built to impress. Nothing wrong with that. A lot of what you need in your business, you need that." He paused. "That Oliver was built to do what it does for however long it takes. No spec sheet. No rating that anyone was going to read. Just the work." "Why didn't you call somebody?" Marcus asked. "When you saw we were stuck. Why'd you wait 2 days?" Earl thought about this. "Wanted to make sure you'd actually tried everything," he said. "Didn't seem right to walk in before you'd done what you knew how to do. Wouldn't have felt the same." Marcus wrote a check, to the Preservation Society for $12,000, which was more than he had originally intended and which felt approximately right. He gave it to Earl, who folded it once without looking at it and put it in the pocket of his overalls. "Come back sometime," Earl said. "I'll show you how the belt pulley works." Marcus did go back. Several times he went back that fall and twice the following spring, and eventually he went back with his son Daniel, all who was 14, and at the age where everything built before 1990 seemed irrelevant. Marcus took Daniel into the barn and Earl showed him the Oliver and explained the drawbar and the snatch block and the geometry of the chain setup, and Daniel listened the way young people listen when they're more interested than they're willing to admit. Let me tell you about the years that followed. Earl Maybury became something in Calverton County that he had never sought to become, a legend of the practical kind, the kind that gets attached to a person when they have repeatedly and quietly done something that other people couldn't. He was called on twice more in the years after Marcus's truck, once to recover a skid steer that had rolled into a pond on the Hennessy property, and once, more significantly, to free a road grader that had sunk into a reclaimed strip mine access road during a county project in 2019 that had defeated a recovery crew from 2 counties over. Both times Earl came with his flatbed and his chain and his Oliver, and both times the outcome was the same. Marcus Holt finished the overpass contract 4 days late, which cost him a penalty clause that was not trivial. He paid it without complaint and without attempting to negotiate, which was noticed by the county engineer, and which did more for his professional reputation than any on-time finish might have. He had learned something about the difference between the image of competence and competence itself, and he carried that lesson into every project he took on afterward. He stopped buying equipment based on its specifications and started asking what the machine was actually built to do, and in what conditions, and for how long. He told the story of Earl and the Oliver at an industry dinner in Cleveland 2 years later, in front of 230 people, and he did not soften it or spare himself. He told it the way it happened, including the laugh, especially the laugh. The room was quiet when he finished, that kind of quiet that means something landed. Earl Maybury passed in the spring of 2022 at 84, following a winter that had been harder on him than he had let anyone know until it was too late for them to do much about it. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church on County Road 14 and was attended by, among others, Marcus Holt and his son Daniel, who was by then in his late 20s and working for his father's company in a project management role. The Preservation Society sent flowers. The county road crew sent 2 men who stood at the back of the church in their work clothes and held their hard hats in their hands. The Oliver went to Earl's grandson, a young man named Curtis, who had grown up watching his grandfather work on it, and who had, at 12 years old, been allowed to drive it in low range around the backfield under Earl's instruction. Curtis was 26 when Earl died and was in the process of deciding what to do with his life, and the inheritance of the Oliver, along with Earl's notes, and the technical manual Earl had found in Columbus and the box of chains and the snatch block, helped clarify something in him that had been unclear. He kept the machine in the same barn. He learned the maintenance from Earl's records. He made one small modification, replacing a cracked inspection cover on the fuel system with a fabricated piece, and otherwise left it as it was. Marcus donated a further $5,000 to the Preservation Society in Earl's name, and he called Curtis Maybury to tell him directly that if Curtis ever needed anything, he should call. It was 3 years later that Daniel Holt, project manager for a drainage remediation contract in the southern part of the county, found himself standing at the edge of a work site where a tracked loader had slid into a reclaimed wetland and could not be recovered by the 2 wrecker units he had on contract. He stood there for 40 minutes, trying different approaches, each one failing. And then he took out his phone and called a number he had in his contacts under the name Maybury Farm. A young man answered. "This is Daniel Holt," Daniel said. "Earl's friend Marcus's son. I've got a machine stuck and I think I need the Oliver." There was a brief pause. "I know who you are," Curtis said. "My grandfather talked about your father. I'll load up." He arrived 40 minutes later, with the flatbed and the chain and the snatch block and the tractor that had been built in Iowa in 1933. He offloaded it the same way Earl had always offloaded it, on wooden ramps in low range. He walked around the stuck machine for a long time without speaking. Then he set his chain at an angle and engaged the clutch, and the steel wheels bit into the earth, and the old engine dropped into its deep working note. And the thing that could not be moved began, slowly and without drama, to move. Daniel Holt stood at the edge of the wetland and watched, and somewhere in the space between his father's story and the thing he was seeing with his own eyes, he understood something that no specification sheet had ever told him, and no project management software had ever calculated. Some things do not become obsolete. They simply wait for people to remember why they were built.